Hello everyone, welcome to our Truth Be Told YouTube channel, with your host Rick Howard and Mike Maney.
Well, hello, Mike.
Well, hello, Brother Rick.
Hello, everybody out there in cyber world, AI world.
Yes.
Mike was just telling me that his Zoom, the Zoom program he has now has been upgraded to where it offers AI technology help. And so we were kind of playing around with that a little bit. And so we elder senior citizen guys, gray hair, no hair, we're being forced into the 21st century in technology. And he was saying his son Peter uses the AI technology all the time for his secular job.
Yes.
And I know a lot of people do. I haven't played around with it much. I'm too afraid of it. I told Mike before we came on that over there in Revelation 13, it describes the false prophet. He's going to tell those of the world to make an image of the beast that can speak, and demanded to be worshipped. And the language there is that he's going to farm it out to tech companies to use AI and 3D printing or whatever they're going to combine together, produce exactly what the false prophet prompts them to do.
Yes.
They're going to be able to come up with it. It's going to appear to be alive. It's called an image.
Mm-hmm.
An image of what? An image of the beast.
Mm-hmm. So
we were surmising. By the way, today is November the 8th, 2023. This is what, session 84. Mike Maney and Rick Howard. And we're doing these Truth Be Told recordings, going through the Old Testament, mainly looking for Christ. And we're going to be able to talk about some of this stuff today because we're going to be in number 16, that great story of the rebellion against Moses and Aaron by Korah and his followers. But getting back to what I was talking about, that it says he's going to have them produce an image of the beast.
Mm-hmm.
Why is it an image of the beast? If the beast is still there, why produce an image of the beast? So we were surmising that whole death and resurrection event in the first part of Revelation 13. Will that be a real event, or will it be made to look like a real event through the use of AI and other technology? It says he will be killed. He's going to receive a death wound, a head wound. It says a couple of places in Revelation 13. So at some point he's going to die or be killed. I have surmised that it might be Israel who assassinates him because he's trying to annihilate them. And they're pretty good at picking off bad guys.
They are, yes.
The leaders of Hamas. They're able to find them and exterminate them. As the Israelis say, we've removed them.
Yes.
They don't tell us exactly how.
Yeah. Sometimes they use the word neutralize.
Neutralized.
Yes.
So if they end up actually assassinating the Antichrist, which would be a huge event, and then if that false prophet is able to use AI and 3D printing and whatever else he has at his disposal to make it appear that the Antichrist has been resurrected, come back to life, and it will appear so real, which AI by that time will even be more advanced than it is now, and other technologies, that resurrection event, whether it's true or made to be true, people will receive it as true. It will look so real, at least, that it will be accepted, and all over the internet, instantly, on TV, instantly, on the watch that you're wearing, instantly, the smartwatches, smartphones, so pretty much everyone in the world within minutes will see that this man is back alive again. And if that image of the beast is such a duplication of him that it appears he's come back to life, then no wonder the world is going to wonder after the beast, and no wonder they'll be able to force that mark of the beast. And no wonder those who do not worship him will be put to death.
Mm-hmm.
Is because it will seem so miraculous, it will seem so unreal that he has power of life over death, which we say only God has,
Mm-hmm.
but it will appear that he has the power of God. And that's why 2 Thessalonians 2 says when he sits as in the temple, he will declare himself that he is God. And he will be received to that degree because of that event. So we were just kind of kicking around the idea that through the use of modern technology that Mike and I are just barely able to scratch the surface of, this false prophet character, whoever he is, will be able to replace in some way, it's called the image of the beast, will be able to replace the real beast who was killed. And so we say, well, is it a real resurrection or is it a made to appear to be real? And that hardly even matters because it will be received as real.
Yes, it'll be received. Yes.
The deception is we often talk about that, Jesus warns that the number one warning of the end times, the number one element of the end times from the mystery of iniquity standpoint is deception.
Mm-hmm.
And that deception will be so deceptive that it will appear not to be deception, because
right,
best deception doesn't appear to be deception.
Right. Yeah.
And it will be so deceptive that it will be received as the truth. And that's why God steps in further in 2 Thessalonians 2 and says that he sends them strong delusion because they chose to believe the lie and not receive the love of the truth. Well, what is the lie? Well, maybe the lie will be that the Antichrist has been resurrected, but it will be received as the truth, and God's just going to give the world over to that because it will seem so convincing and so real and true that no one can deny it. There'll be no way of proving it wrong. And so, like we are seeing currently over in Israel with Hamas, the claim a few weeks ago that Israel dropped a bomb on a hospital and killed 500 people in the hospital. I knew it was fake right away because the images they were showing the same day and the next day were just like random people running around carrying stretchers of some guy kind of bandaged up and kids with dirt on their face crying. I think, well, they could grab those images anywhere, maybe produce them through AI. Someone said that they are producing images with AI of wounded, damaged buildings, dead people, and carried on stretchers and ambulances and things. That is actually a product of AI. So it's the first war that AI is a weapon to make what's happening appear to be true, even if it's not true.
Brother Rick, can I share with our audience an image, speaking of AI, that I used AI to generate this image. I'll hold this up so our viewers can see it.
You produced that with AI?
I produced this with AI, ChatGPT. Some of our viewers may have already heard of that platform, but they're called prompts. And so you open up the program and you type in what it is that you want. And so I asked ChatGPT to give me an image of Jesus in the desert, surrounded by disciples who were eagerly anticipating his teaching, who were very interested in what he had to say. And so this is what it generated, just like that. And so it's just one example. I've been using it now for our church bulletin. If I don't have an image myself, I just go in there and ask certain criteria, and it produces an image, and I just put it in our church bulletin. So these are downloadable. Once they're produced, you just download them. So there's no copyright because it's just building it on the fly. So there's nobody owns it. So it's really free.
The original with you based on your prompts.
Yeah.
So it's not violating any
no
trademarks or any
no royalties.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
But this is amazing. And the fact that we're living in these times and seeing these things, you and I were talking about some of these scriptures, we really didn't have a framework to put them into. But now with AI and 3D printing, we now have a framework, in which to pour this information.
We've taught for years about he will instruct those to make an image of the beast, but until high tech came along, till AI and 3D printing, until whatever takes their place, we're starting to grasp how that can be done.
Yes.
To where he can subcontract that out to the tech companies through their use of AI and 3D printing and other means, and say, this is what I want. And maybe he tells them he wants it because, the Antichrist has been killed. And he wants to continue that power base. And so they're able to come up with what appears to be a resurrected man of sin, that, because we're even being, we were told, like in Syria, we were told in other recent wars, that the leader that we were seeing on the screen was not really the leader. It was a stand-in with makeup and the right clothes, and because they wanted it to appear their leader was still alive. And it was close enough that without really observing it with technology and other means, the average person would look at that image and say, yeah, he's still alive. That's what the false prophet's going to be able to produce. And it will come on our smartphones and computer screens and television screens and so forth. And the whole world will believe it to be true and will react to it accordingly, even if, as 2 Thessalonians 2 calls it, even if it's the lie. So the lie will be the most deceptive thing ever, received as the truth. And because people did not receive the real truth of God and the word of God, God's going to send them strong delusion. So it's just interesting how all of this is coming about. And what's this have to do with number 16, the rebellion of Korah against Moses and Aaron? And well, it has a whole lot to do with it. And it's easy to tie it into the first coming of Christ and the second coming of Christ. Because Moses was the appointed leader. So we would call it, Moses was God's election. What makes God more upset than almost anything is when people rebel against his elective choices. Psalm 2, why do the nations rage against the Lord and against his anointed? Because he has set his king on his holy hill. So he has elected his son to be king in Jerusalem when it's all over. And that's the real heart of why the nations are raging. It's a continuation of them raging against the election of Isaac over Ishmael, of Jacob over Esau, of Joseph and Judah as the promises of the firstborn and rulership over the other sons. God has made choices, and as a result, the nation of Israel, he calls it in Ezekiel 36, I believe. Let me turn over there real quick. He calls that little speck of land over there that the whole world wants to fight over. He said in Ezekiel 36:5, he calls it my land. So that particular piece of land, of course, the whole earth is the Lord's, but he has chosen that particular piece. That's why he brought Abram out of Ur to that place, because that's the place he chose. So there's a chosen land, a chosen people in that land, a chosen king eventually to rule over the world from that land, his own son. And that really is the heart of the rage of the nations, is they hate God's election.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why election is such an important subject in the Bible, not as it is so often applied today to personal salvation, where God chooses one for eternal life and the other is not chosen, so they're doomed to hell. Election in the Bible is about his elect son, his elect people, his elect place.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, it's my land and I'm going to give it to whoever I want. And of course, so many times in Genesis 12 and 15 and 17, and to Isaac and Jacob and so forth, he says, I have given you this land.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time he said that, they were surrounded by their enemies.
Mm-hmm.
That was his election.
Mm-hmm.
Those nations raged against it. And Joshua had to clean them out. And can you imagine at the end of the book of Joshua, how he would have replied if there were television news people, reporters, even religious people around the world who said, you are an occupier. This is your occupation against the people it really belongs to. And how would Joshua have replied?
With a sword.
He would have replied kind of like what Caleb said about his land inheritance of Judah. Give me this mountain.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to destroy those giants that my generation said, we can't take it because there's giants in the land and we're worried about our women and children. We just came through that in Numbers 13 and 14 and 15. And God through Caleb basically said, you know, those giants that you used as an excuse not to come in 38 years before we did, and me and Joshua had to get older and hear your complaints and see you die in the wilderness when we could have come in earlier.
Yep.
Well, I want that mountain.
Mm-hmm.
Took it. Mm-hmm. And they could have called him an occupier all they wanted, but he was glad to be in that land, and so was Joshua. So I think that's how it's God's land to give. Why is there such rage against Israel today? They're raging against Israel, but they're really raging against the God of Israel.
Yes.
Who chose that land for that people. And one way to look at the millennial is that for 1,000 years, the nations of the world will be forced to admit God's election was right all along. We fought against it. We tried to stop it. We tried to destroy it. But now for 1,000 years, they're going to have to submit to it.
Yeah. And they're reminded every day that they wake up when they see the Messiah inside the city and a selected people, they're ruling the nations. They're reminded every day that they're not a part of that choice. And so by the time you get to the end of the millennium, they're fed up with it. And they can't stand it any longer. So they, just like we see in Korah, there's yet another rebellion.
Yes. So they're going to be forced to say, in fact, the last verse of Zechariah 8 says, in those days, 10 men from every language of the nation shall grasp the sleeve of a Jewish man, saying, let us go with you, for we have heard that God is with you. And they're going to be forced to admit that they're going to be like Rahab. They're going to be like Ruth. They're going to be like the Queen of Sheba, that the evidence is so overwhelming of who God has chosen that they're going to say, well, we've tried to fight against it for thousands of years and that hasn't worked. So maybe we should just try giving into it.
Right.
Okay, it looks like you were right all along, Jews.
Yeah.
So okay,
yeah,
maybe we ought to just come with you instead of fighting against it. Maybe we'll just surrender to it. Of course, by the end of the 1,000 years, there'll be a large group that will rebel against it. So this idea of getting back to number 16, this idea of rebellion against God's elected leaders is so important in the Bible, so that David would not even lift his hand against the Lord's anointed, because as bad as Saul was at that time, we think deserving of death, David still understood that even in their lack of faith, their lack of accepting God as their rightful king.
Mhm.
They wanted a king like the other nations. God allowed them to have that, and God was the one who selected the man,
Mhm.
partly to teach them a lesson,
Mhm.
but partly because, as Samuel said, when you were small in your own eyes, that he got too big for his britches,
Mhm.
as we say. And so David understood that, okay, right or wrong, and all the wrong motives of the people and so forth, God did select Saul.
Mhm.
David was not going to rage against God's election.
Mhm.
And so he was willing to live in a cave. He was willing to be out in the wilderness. He was willing to go live with the Philistines for a while. He was
Mhm.
willing to froth at the mouth, to
Mhm.
pretend madness. He was
Mhm.
willing to do all sorts of humiliating
Yeah.
things to himself
Yeah.
to not rage against God's election. That's how deep-seated
Yeah.
David understood what God has chosen. I better not fight against.
Mhm.
And then that brings us to the time of Jesus' first coming, when what I call, I use this word officialness. So, Israel had rebelled and rejected God and sinned and all that, lack of faith, a lot along the way. But when Jesus finally pronounced their house desolate in just a few days advance of when it became official, because he knew that they were going to say in John 19:15, I believe it is, when Pilate said, "What shall I do with your king?" And they said, "We have no king but Caesar." I call that official apostasy,
Mhm.
where they officially announced as a nation their rejection of their Messiah as their rightful king, and they chose a pagan king
Mhm.
as their king.
Mhm.
And the Jewish leaders, and then, what shall I do with him then? Crucify him, crucify him.
Mhm.
So I call that the official apostasy of Israel, to where God had the right at that point to pronounce their house desolate, to take the kingdom from them and give it to a nation bearing the fruit of it. And so they were rebelling. The elect nation was rebelling against the elect king,
Mhm.
and they paid a big price for it.
Mhm.
So this idea of rebelling against God's choices is what number 16 is all about.
Mhm.
And it's really a theme that runs through the Bible and is really important to the first coming of Christ, and is especially important to the second coming of Christ, because Paul says in 2 Thessalonians 2 and 3 that the two events of verse 1, the parousia of Christ, the coming of Christ, the arrival of Christ, and our gathering together to him, will not happen unless two other things happen.
Mhm.
One is the revelation of the Antichrist, which happens at the Abomination of Desolation in his death and resurrection event, and that evil prophet having the people of the world produce an image of the beast, whatever that means. But the other event that must happen first is the apostasy, the rebellion.
Mhm.
So this spirit of rebellion that was in Cain, that was in Nimrod, that was in Korah, that was in the Jewish leaders, that was in the nation at his death, is going to be revived in a very graphic and large way around the world, leading up to the return of Christ. There's going to be a rebellion against God's election.
Mhm.
And his election today, his elect people, the church, Israel is an elect nation, even in their unbelief. We call them the beloved enemy.
Mhm.
They're enemies for the gospel's sake.
Mhm.
Because of the promise to the Father's sake, they're beloved.
Mhm.
So God even loves them in their rebellion. And he's going to, Hosea chapter 2 says, in the wilderness, by the way, it's a real interesting verse in Hosea 2. He says, I will allure them in the wilderness. So during that period of time, they are in their wilderness protection with the church in some way helping them. God's going to use that time to allure them back to him. Yet they're still in their unbelief and rejection at that point. So they're still beloved enemies, we call them. And that great rebellion, that falling away, how would you explain that, Mike? That in 2 Thessalonians 2:3, there's the definite article in front of apostasy. It's a particular, it's a special event that's called the apostasy, the falling away. So it's not just a general, people leaving church one or two at a time or anything like that. It's going to be a recognizable, graphic, dramatic event. So how do you see that, the apostasy at that time?
I've never really looked at it as a specific point in time, but like you said, I've looked at it more in that general sense, kind of a slow burn rather than a big explosion. I don't think I ever noticed the definite article, but that would definitely point to something specific. But I've always just looked at the falling away as, falling away from the Korah doctrine. And certainly we've seen that in our own time. We've seen people fall away, different directions. Some fall to universalism, some fall to hyper covenantism, some just fall out. The world gets a hold of them, and that's been going on for quite some time, and will continue. So, but I've never looked at it as a specific before, as a specific momentous event.
I've looked at it. So I've made the last 5 or 10 years. I've made 2 Thessalonians 2 a chapter of special focus. I keep coming back to it time and time again. Every time I come back to it, it seems a little clearer, better understanding of it, maybe. And I think that there's two parts to it. I think verse 4 describes the apostasy that reveals the man of sin. The apostasy is when he goes into the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Well, sometimes we say falling away can't happen unless you're first in the truth in order to fall away from it. But I think what's happening and I think verse 4 is describing the abomination of desolation, just in different language. I think that the abomination of desolation, one way to describe it, and I think this is what ties it into falling away from the truth, is that it's an event that happens on the earth that is a mirror image of what happened in heaven with Lucifer. So Lucifer rebelled against God that he knew was the true God, because God had created him. And so he knew the truth and he rebelled against that. And so that can fall under the strict definition of what apostasy is, falling away from the truth. And that same spirit of Lucifer then enters the Antichrist. So basically, the Antichrist, through Satan, is doing on earth what had happened in heaven, rebelling against God. And he declares himself to be God. So I think it can be accepted that in itself is a great rebellion against revealed truth, that there is a true God. And that because Satan has empowered him, Satan is duplicating on the earth exactly what he had done in heaven. So that's the tie-in, I think, to making it fit the definition of falling away from the truth. Then there's a second part, I think, to it, is that the abomination of desolation is at the same time as his death and resurrection event, however that works itself out. And the abomination of desolation is also what causes the image of the beast to be made, to be worshipped, which then triggers the mark of the beast, which those who do not worship the beast and take the mark will be killed. So my point is that this event in verse 4 that is, I think, enlarging on the idea of what the falling away is, then triggers a line that is, we say a line in the sand. A clear line is drawn that forces people to be on one or the other side of it, meaning no longer will people be able to be nominal Christians, just in speech, but not in action and not in truth. So that mark of the beast is going to trigger a clear stand one way or another. And I think that might be the actual falling away, because once that is in place, a decision will be forced. And many, I think, at that very point will fall away. So I think that's why it can be called the falling away. There's always been a falling away. But the fact that this is tied into the same timing as the man of sin is revealed puts it there right in the middle of that last 7 years. And I think it's easy to understand that once he has that death and resurrection event, once he commits the abomination of desolation, declares himself that he is God, and once that image is made and the mark of the beast is in place, then there's no middle ground anymore. You're either on one side or the other.
A thought just occurred to me, Brother Rick, that I don't think that anyone who is saved during that time will be able to take the mark, because I think that's aligned with that punishment's aligned with the lake of fire. But the thought that came to my mind was, if the separation is made and the pressure is put on them to receive the mark or to not receive the mark, it may very well be that if in their hearts they're going to take the mark, they're going to fall away in that time frame, that God may just very well do to them what he did to Ananias and Sapphira when they rebelled against the church's direction of selling their properties and giving the proceeds to the church, that they rebelled in their hearts. And what did God do? He just instantly killed them. So it may very well be that might be pointing to those in that time frame when the line is drawn. Like you say, the line is drawn, and you either take the mark or not. If in your heart you're willing and ready to take that mark, and you're a saved person, it may be that God just kills you.
That's a good point. So you brought up Ananias and Sapphira. So there's a number of examples of rebellion against God's choices. So Ananias and Sapphira rebelled against what the church was practicing. They rebelled against it by lying. They weren't forced to give everything.
Right.
They said we gave everything, but they kept part back. And I like the wording in that story. It says, from that time on, no one dared to join the disciples. But the next verse says, but the Lord added to them daily. So we might say that Ananias and Sapphira maybe were church joiners. It wasn't really in their heart.
Uh-huh.
And from it, it caused such fear that people who were not being added by God
Mm-hmm.
were afraid to join
Mm-hmm.
early church because of
Mm-hmm.
what had happened to Ananias, because it was all done right out in public.
Mm-hmm.
So that everyone would be talking about it. But the story of Korah and his rebellion is, it ties in with so many other things in the Bible. Because Korah was a son of Kohath, a
Mm-hmm.
son of Levi. So he was, might say, a cousin
Yeah.
to Moses.
Mm-hmm.
He was of the priestly people. So he wasn't he wasn't part of the mixed multitude.
Mm-hmm.
He was part of the inner group.
Mm-hmm.
And so it ties into verses like Jesus talks about. You'll be betrayed, by family members. You'll be
Mm-hmm.
betrayed by fellow church members.
Mm-hmm.
The betrayal will be those closest to you in many cases during that time. And Korah is an example of that taking place back there in the wilderness. We're not really told about the background of Korah enough, but I think that Moses and Aaron probably never suspected that Korah would be a leader of a great rebellion.
Mm-hmm.
It probably took them by surprise. And that's what true, deceptive, rebellious betrayal is. It's from those you would not suspect.
Well, David didn't suspect his son Absalom would betray him either.
No, he didn't, did he?
No.
Um, so this Korah story, I call it one of the most powerful yet least understood chapters in the Bible.
Mm.
This idea of rebelling against God's elective leaders or his choices in general. Again, tying it to Psalm 2. And he was joined by sons of Reuben, the firstborn.
Mm.
And they rose up before Moses in verse 2, 250. And it's interesting, the language here, it calls them 250 leaders of the congregation. So these were men who had proven themselves worthy of respect, worthy of being the leaders of the tribes. Again, in some ways above suspicion,
Mm-hmm.
would have never expected these to be the ones to lead out in this rebellion. It kind of just rose up. And so they're very much like the 10 spies who brought back the evil report. They were leaders of their tribes. So there's something here about don't expect the rebellion and don't expect the betrayal to come from members who are there once a month, barely take part, and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Can often come from, as Jesus said about Judas, one of my friends,
Mm-hmm.
one who broke bread with me.
Mm-hmm.
He was the treasurer of the church.
Yeah, yeah.
Even the other apostles did not suspect Judas. Even when he left the upper room to go finalize the deal, they thought he was going to buy some more food, or something like that. Even then, they did not suspect him. And so I think it shocked them. They all,
Mm-hmm.
Jesus said, one of you is going to betray me. They all said, is it me? Is it me? Is it
Mm-hmm.
me?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, if it was that obvious, they would have all, looked over at Judas.
Mm-hmm.
So the betrayal during the tribulation time is going to be especially painful, I think, because it's going to be unexpected.
Mm-hmm.
People who actually betray each other. And even Daniel 11 talks about during that time, some will join them by intrigue.
Mm.
Paul warned the Ephesus church that wolves in sheep's clothing.
Mhm.
So some will come in from the outside, but then the other warning there in Acts 20,
Mhm.
but the other danger is men will rise up among you,
Mhm.
not sparing the flock.
Mhm. Again, another
That's the
rebellion.
one you can't detect.
Mhm.
Yeah, so this story of Korah's rebellion against Moses and Aaron is not put in the Bible to be just a standalone, isolated event, that happened back there. It is closely tied in with major themes and major events all the way through the Bible, including the two comings of Christ and the work of the Antichrist. So it's a really important chapter.
Well, including, as you mentioned earlier, the rebellion of Lucifer. So it's just it just represents that rebellion against God's elect and his choices, like you were saying.
Moses fell on his face when they came to him in verse 3. You take too much. They gathered together against Moses and Aaron. Just like Psalm 2, they gather against the Lord and against his anointed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And said to them, you take too much upon yourselves, for all the congregation is holy, every one of them, and the Lord is among them. Why then do you exalt yourselves above the congregation of the Lord? But they did not exalt themselves. How many times up to this point had Moses acted as intercessor?
Mm-hmm.
Lord, I know they deserve your punishment, but please be merciful to them.
Yeah.
He tried to get out of it, didn't he, in the beginning?
Mm-hmm.
He did not set himself above.
No.
But that was the accusation. Often the accusation must be made to look worse than it really is in order to gain the approval of the crowd.
Mm-hmm.
So the accusation, they may have even known the accusation was extreme and not true, but they made the accusation to gain the favor of the majority of people.
Well, in psychology, it's called projection.
Projection.
He's projecting his own character onto Moses.
So Moses fell on his face because he was the meekest man on the earth, the Bible says. And he spoke to Korah and all his company, saying, tomorrow morning the Lord will show who is his and who is holy.
Yes.
Well, they were all a holy nation, at least in calling, but the Lord was going to make a distinction about, this is my election. This was my choice, and it's not you.
Right.
And they faced a really terrible punishment as a result. When you, and I keep bringing this point up, but a lot of people just overlook this, I think, in the Bible. To recognize God's elective right to choose who he will choose, and to rebel against that is a major sin in God's eyes.
Yes.
And it's one of the worst rebellions you can make, because you're basically saying, I don't agree with God's choice. Yeah, I don't agree with God's decision, and so I'm going to rebel against it. Well, that's basically saying that I have a right to say that God is wrong. That's a pretty big deal.
Yeah.
And will cause him to come near to him, that one whom he chooses, there's election again, he will cause to come near to him. So they went about it, and most people that watch this are fairly familiar with the story. But he said in verse 10, are you seeking the priesthood also? They already had an important position. It's kind of like when Aaron and Miriam, told Moses, you're taking too much on you. And Miriam, her arm and hand, was it, turned to leprosy. Moses interceded on her behalf.
Yeah. Yeah.
So they already had an important position, but it's not enough. It's the spirit of Lucifer.
Yes.
What high position he had was still not enough.
Yes.
That's what pride does to us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I may be right near the top, but I want to be at the top.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why it's so surprising, but it shouldn't be. That's some of the greatest envy that there is, and jealousy is among the super rich, because no matter how wealthy you are, there's always someone a little bit wealthier and a little bit more powerful than you. And when you get that high up, you always have your sight set on those above you.
Mm-hmm.
So those who seem to have so much wealth and power are some of the most envious and jealous people of all, because they recognize there's still someone above me.
Don't the Proverbs say is it the eyes of man are never satisfied or something like that?
Yeah. Those who have wealth are not satisfied with wealth.
Mm-hmm.
Those who have power not satisfied with power. And so he issues the ultimatum, says that God's going to take care of us. And he called some in verse 12 Dathan and Abiram, the sons of Eliab, but they said, "We will not come up. We're just not going to obey. We're not going to recognize your authority," which really means we're not going to recognize God's choice of you to be our leader. Reject that. And they said in verse 13, "Is it a small thing that you have brought us up out of a land flowing with milk and honey?" So they're calling Egypt a land flowing with milk and honey. "To kill us in the wilderness, that you should keep acting as a prince over us." Isn't that kind of what 40 years earlier, 40 plus years earlier, those fellow Israelite men that Moses, when he was a prince in Egypt, tried to break up their fight.
Right.
Why do you keep acting as a prince over us?
Yeah.
Who are you?
Yeah.
Well, here's the same attitude in these Israelites.
Yes.
Same attitude Moses faced 40 years earlier that caused him to flee. Now he's going to end up acting as their intercessor. So he had learned a lot in those 40 years on the backside of the desert. That it was after that he's called the meekest man on the earth.
Yeah. Yeah. It's odd that he was the meekest man on the earth in God's eyes, but in everyone else's eyes, he was this arrogant guy wanting to have the rule over everybody.
Well, again, projection, huh?
Yeah. Yeah.
They were projecting their own rebellious spirit and desire for power onto Moses. And that's real common, isn't it, today? People do that.
Yeah.
So they said, "We will not come up." Well, Moses was very angry in verse 15. Said to the Lord, "Do not respect their offering. I have not taken one donkey from them." If you don't take one donkey from a person, you should be trusted.
Right.
You're not doing them any harm. "Nor have I hurt any one of them." So, we know the process. They took their censers. And Moses said in verse 21, "Separate yourselves from this congregation, that I may consume them in a moment." They fell on their faces in verse 22. "O God, the God of the spirits of all flesh, shall one man sin and you be angry with all the congregation?" So, he had kind of swayed the people by accusing Moses wrongfully with extreme accusations. But now those same people were saying, "Hey, it wasn't us.
Yeah.
Whatever you want to do to him, do to him, but please don't punish us." So it shows how fickle people are,
I'm glad that Moses didn't pay attention to the old Yiddish proverb. I'm glad that he didn't listen to that Yiddish proverb.
What is that Yiddish proverb, Mike?
"If one man calleth thee a donkey, pay him no mind. But if two men calleth thee a donkey, get thee a saddle."
I've never heard that Yiddish proverb. Thank you for sharing that.
So here, everyone's accusing Moses of being someone he's not. I'm glad he didn't listen to them and go out and get a saddle. Instead, he says, I haven't even taken one donkey from you people. So he stood his ground.
He stood his ground. And so the Lord spoke to Moses, verse 23, speak to the congregation, saying, get away from the tents of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. Moses rose, went to Dathan and Abiram. The elders of Israel followed him, and he spoke, saying, depart now from the tents of these wicked men, touch nothing of theirs, lest you be consumed in all their sins. So they got away. I mean, they'd seen the miracles of God in Egypt, and they'd seen God's power working through Moses. So they knew he means business.
Yes.
He means business. So back to this idea of the mark of the beast and the falling away in the middle of the 7 years and all that, a line was drawn here, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
A line was drawn.
Mm-hmm.
You choose which side of the line you want to be on.
Yeah.
And if you choose to hang out on that side, you're going to be killed with them.
Mm-hmm.
But if you choose to come on this side, there'll be some mercy. Then Moses said, so they got away, their sons, their little children, they made sure the whole families. Moses said in verse 28, by this you shall know that the Lord has sent me. God chose me. I didn't choose me. I tried to get out of it.
Right.
God chose me. So your problem is not with me. Your problem is with God.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's what election is all about.
Mm-hmm.
And that the Lord has sent me to do all these works, for I have not done them of my own will. I did not choose myself.
No.
No man should be a pastor of a church who chose himself.
Right. Exactly.
Should be the one that the Lord chooses through the will of the church.
Yeah.
He places it on that man's heart.
Mm-hmm.
You call yourself to be a pastor of a church, you're asking for trouble.
Yes.
It's not going to end well.
Yes.
If these men die naturally, like all men, then the Lord has not sent me. But if the Lord creates a new thing, opens up the earth, swallows them, they go alive into the pit. What a scary way to die.
Yes.
Scary way to die.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Then you will understand that these men have rejected the Lord, not rejected me.
Right.
Rejected the Lord. That's who the real issue is with.
Mm-hmm.
And it came to pass as he finished speaking, the ground split apart, the earth opened up and swallowed them up with their households and all the men with Korah with their goods.
Mm-hmm.
They went alive down into the pit.
Yes. Wow.
Can you imagine if you were like one of those who had been swayed, but when it came right down to it, you said, don't blame us,
Mm-hmm.
And so Moses said, okay, get away.
Mm-hmm.
And so you get away, and then you see this happen, you think, boy,
yeah,
I barely escaped.
Yes.
That could have been me in there.
Yes, absolutely.
Because that was in many of their hearts to go along with it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Then all Israel who were around them, verse 34, fled at their cry, for they said, lest the earth swallow us up also. Because I think deep in their hearts, a lot of them knew we deserved the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
This was kind of our thinking as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So verse 35, a fire came out from the Lord, consumed the 250 men who were offering incense. I have a little note in my Bible here that says God killed them while they were appearing righteous. They were offering incense. They were trying to correct their mistake with their own works. Let's just go offer some incense and then God will be okay with us. So God killed them with fire while they were offering incense. With incense involves fire. So they were using fire to try to appease God's wrath. God said, I'm going to send fire on them. Offer them as incense. Their bodies, their physical bodies.
Wow.
Yeah, this is a pretty graphic thing, isn't it?
It is, yes.
It says so he told Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, pick up the censers out of the blaze, for the censers are holy. The men aren't holy, but the censers are holy. Scatter the fire some distance away. And I like the wording in verse 38. The censers of these men who sinned against their own soul.
Wow.
Isn't that something?
Yes, yes.
Sinned against their own souls. When
Mhm.
you rebel against the Lord, you sin against your own soul.
Yes, yes.
Pretty strong language.
Mm-hmm.
What was the result? It's so predictable. So predictable. In verse 41. On the next day, after they saw all of that they saw the judgment of God, on the
Mhm.
next day, all the congregation of the children of Israel murmured against Moses.
Yes.
And
Yes.
Aaron, saying, you have killed the people of the Lord. Won't they ever learn? No wonder God said, they rebelled against me in the wilderness, and that generation was not allowed to enter the land.
Mm-hmm.
Every time they turned around,
Mm-hmm.
God shows them some magnificent miracle or judgment so that they could understand what God's will was. I have a note in my Bible next to verse 41. Did the people rally to Moses' side? Just the opposite, didn't
It's
they?
the opposite.
Just the opposite.
You know, it doesn't, I'm baffled how they could witness this rebellion, and then they could witness God's punishment of this rebellion and still ascribe to these people that they're the people of God, that God killed.
Yes. Yeah.
You know, we're kind of seeing this today where the Hamas goes in there and murders in cold blood unarmed citizens, 1,400 Israelis, and the people are on their side and saying that they deserve the land. And in other words, they're totally on the side of these murderers, ascribing it as if they're some, virtuous people. It just amazes me how people can have this twisted.
It is, huh? It's upside down, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
It's upside down. So, of course, God said in verse 44, the Lord spoke to Moses saying, get away from among this congregation, that I may consume them in a moment. Boy, here's just broken record, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Over and over, they make the same mistake, and God is ready to destroy them. They fell on their faces. Moses told Aaron, take a censer, put fire in it from the altar, put incense on it. Take it quickly. We're in panic mode here.
Mm-hmm.
Take it quickly, the congregation, and make atonement for them. Intercessory work. That's why Moses is such a great type of Christ. We keep messing up.
Yeah.
Keep sinning. We keep rebelling. We keep having the same spirit at different times in our lives.
Yeah.
And Christ keeps coming along saying, Father, forgive them.
Mm-hmm.
Father, forgive them for my sake. Make an intercession for us.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder what would happen to us if we didn't have an intercessor.
Oh. Shudder to think.
Yeah. Make atonement for them, for wrath has gone out from the Lord. The plague has begun. So he did it. And it says in verse 48, he stood between the dead and the living. So the plague was stopped. Isn't that a beautiful picture of Christ? Stands before the living and the dead. When we all deserve death, he stands in between and asks God to give us life. So the plague was stopped. 14,700 died in that plague, besides those of Korah and the 250 and those with Korah. So the plague was stopped because of intercession and the mercy of God. I have someone at my door that I need to get, and plus I have an appointment I need to get to. I just looked at the time.
Okay.
We spent so much time before the recording started that so they cut this part a little bit short, but I think we hit the high points of that number 16. There's it's a much more pivotal chapter than we think. Anyway, I better get off and get to the door and take care of
thank you to our viewers, and we'll hope to see you next time.
Thanks, Mike.
You bet. Thank you, Rick.